Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just masked and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the graphic novel apostle.
Hello and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Orenberger, and I am so happy to be here with you, as always. We are back for another book club episode today, where we are going to be talking about Moonshine, Volume 1, by Brian Azzarello, with art and colors by Eduardo Risso. We'll go through the credits in a little more detail in just a second, but I wanted to tell you what that was. And I have here as my guest today, my good friend, Seth Borin, who I have been waiting for months and months to find a good opportunity to get on this podcast, and it's finally here. Seth, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that you ever put good in front of friend before, but that's nice and different. So,
Well,
and, for the record, I would like to just go ahead. Since we're now good friends, I did not bring any pickled eggs into your house today.
Well, that's good. Usually the adjective I use when I'm telling somebody about my friend Seth is my weirdest friend Seth.
Fair.
And yes, there was a time a couple of years ago where we were going to have a pay-per-view fight over here, and I invited a bunch of dudes and didn't ask anybody to bring anything, but a few guys, added some snacks and stuff, and you showed up with a giant, it must have been a 5-gallon jar
of
great pickled eggs that you had pickled yourself, huh?
When you've got chickens, and that was the cheapest eggs you could find. Now look at them.
Well, those were, you think we could use those as a form of currency these days?
Probably.
Okay, well, that would be good. If only I had not made you take those back out to your car and sent you home with them, because, Seth, I love you, brother, but those looked gross.
To each their own.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk just a little bit about what this book is, and then you and I can visit a little bit more about why you and I specifically are talking about it together. So this book, as I mentioned, was written by Brian Azzarello. The artist is Eduardo Risso, who is an Argentinian artist, also did the colors on the book. And Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Risso, I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but they are very much known as one of those creative teams in comics, where when you see one of their names, you'll look for the other, and they do some things with other people as well, but they've got a long history going back to the late 90s of working together as writer and artist. Letters on this book, Jared H. Fletcher, and it was published by Image Comics. So today we're just going to be talking about Volume 1. The entire series ran from 2016 to 2021 for a full 28 issues. This first volume, which obviously started coming out in single issues in 2016, is comprised of issues 1 through 6, and the first volume was collected and published in May of 2017. So we'll be talking through those first 6 issues today. And neither you nor I have read ahead beyond this.
Nope.
And I think we'll see when we get to the end. I don't know that we've hardly dipped our toes into the world of Moonshine yet, because I think we're left hanging with a place where it's like, there's so much more to this world in the hills of Appalachia that we are going to find out about that we haven't even scratched the surface of.
Yeah, this is definitely just an introduction.
And it's funny that I've not read further into this book because I love this Volume 1. I have read this a couple of times over the last few years before I asked you to do this with me on the show, and picked it up and reread it again for that purpose. And I guess I'll just talk about it now because I'm so excited about it. But one of the first things I showed you when you came walking in here was my slabbed copy of issue number 1. Issue number 1, and for our friends, take a look at our Instagram page, Graphic Novel Apostle, or at Graphic Novel Apostle, and we'll have some images of the art from this book, including the cover of the first issue, which is also the cover of the first volume that you have there in front of you, Seth. It is my favorite cover in all of comics. I just love the way you have these silhouetted images of these 3, we'll discover, FBI agents walking through this clearing with a giant full moon up behind them, and you just see them in that shadow. I think it's just such a cool way of using light and shadow. It's just very evocative. And so last year, Eduardo Risso was a guest at Planet Comic-Con in Kansas City. And when I went up there, man, I had my paperback trade of the first volume, I had my hardcover of the whole collected series, and I had a copy of issue number 1 that I wanted to get signed and slabbed, and he's got such a cool-looking signature. So we'll put that up there for you guys to take a look at on the Instagram page. And just to offer a little bit more about Azzarello and Risso working together before I start to ask you some of your thoughts, Seth, about this book. This creative team is probably best known for a series that they did at Vertigo/DC. Vertigo was an imprint or a publishing line at DC in the late 90s and early 2000s, where they got outside of some of the traditional superhero stuff. Some of what they did was creator-owned work by the artists. Other was, work for hire that they did, but it was directed toward more mature audiences, dealt with greater degrees of violence. It mostly was not superhero content, and it also, Vertigo books lived in a world outside of the DC universe, so don't look for Superman here. But they did a series there called 100 Bullets, which ran for 100 issues. From the very end of the 90s all the way up to, I think, 2009 was when they finished up. And it was a crime series with a bit of mystery behind it. And it was, I've read the first volume of that one. I haven't read the whole run of it, but very, very cool. And anyone who looked at that, I could see them wanting to come back for more. And I think I actually prefer what you get here with Moonshine. Seth, I know I'm leaving you just sitting here quiet, but last thing I'll do before I let you talk some is I want to read this blurb from the back of the cover of Volume 1 to give our listeners an idea of what this is we're talking about. So it reads, set deep in Appalachia during Prohibition, Moonshine tells the story of Lou Perlow, a city slick, quote, torpedo sent from New York City to negotiate a deal with the best moonshiner in West Virginia, Hiram Holt. Lou figures it's a milk run. But what he doesn't figure is that Holt's just as cunning and ruthless as any New York City crime boss. Not only will Holt do anything for his illicit booze operation, he'll stop at nothing to protect a much darker, bloodier family secret. And I'm sure that's one we'll talk about in great detail in just a few minutes here. And by the way, to listeners, if you've never listened to one of our book club episodes before of the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast, we are spoiling everything here. So if you want to read this book first and then come back and listen, well, if you don't want to be spoiled, that's maybe the tip for you. And Seth, you have done that with a bunch of our episodes, haven't you?
Spoiled them?
No.
Paused. Yes, I have paused and ran and grabbed them off of Hoopla. I've done both. I go and read the whole thing and then come back and listen to the podcast. My favorite was when I had time when I was working from home and I could actually go through it while I was listening to it and kind of pause and get ahead.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Man, I love that you've done that. I was so flattered right when we launched our first couple of episodes, and you were like, yeah, I've been checking these books out from the library and reading them. And, and it even told me that you'd stopped some of the episodes to read the book first and then come back. I was like, man, that's awesome. And I take it you've liked some of these books.
Yeah, I mean, the books have been great. It's been fun, so it's been something different for me to do, a different form of entertainment that I haven't been into deeply maybe ever, but haven't touched in 12 years.
Cool. So one of the things I'm most excited about as well from your family engaging with this podcast is, I think it was our 5th episode that we did, was our book club on Radiant Black with our mutual friend Travell McManus. And your son has dug into that quite a bit.
Yeah, I was hauling him to school, and we listened to, books typically on the way to school. And I said, Radiant Black, this sounds like something that Van would actually enjoy. So I stopped listening to it, and then I just popped it in and was like, Van, what do you think? And he's like, I love it. How do I get the books?
And I understand he's been burning up your library card too.
Even made Santa's list this year.
Ooh, fantastic. Well, I am thrilled about that. Van is the same age as my son Garrett. Has Van turned 10 yet?
No.
Give that just a little bit of thought. Okay, so Seth has already crossed the 10 line, but they're in the same grade and are good friends. And I can't get Garrett to listen to my podcast for anything, man. Breaks my heart.
Someday.
You
may be dead, but he'll go back and listen to all of them.
I may not leave him anything else when I slough off this mortal coil, but he'll have my voice and yours here on the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast to turn back to, and I'm sure he'll be thanking me plenty for that. All right, Seth, what'd you think about this book?
On the first read, I thought, this is chaos.
Some of it is.
So I enjoyed it, right? Like, I enjoyed it, but it certainly moved fast enough, and the characters are in different groups. Like, it's easy to tell the hillbillies from the gangsters.
Right.
But sometimes which gangster just said that, especially if they're out of the frame.
Yep.
I'm, like, jumping around to figure out, like, who exactly said this. But all in all, like, I will continue to read it, so...
Yeah, as a storytelling issue, if you read this too fast, and there are a lot of pages throughout this book that are not dialogue heavy, some that are completely silent except for the sound effects on the page, especially during like shootouts and some fight scenes and things, where if you try and go through that too fast, there's a lot you will miss. On my first reread of this volume to prepare for this episode, I did that. I went through it kind of fast because I was like, well, I've read the story before. I'll remember all this stuff. And enough time had passed that I needed a good refresher, especially when we got into issue 6 with some of the shootout that goes on in that episode, or rather in that issue. I found myself going, okay, wait, who's alive and who's dead at the end of this now? And which one got taken out in which way? But on a more careful reread to make some notes and things as we went back through this, I was like, oh man, there are layers here that I was just not seeing. So Seth, we're talking here about some moonshiners out in Appalachia during that Prohibition era. So this book is set in 1929. Prohibition was from 1920 to 1933. So we are in the later years of Prohibition, in a period when gangsters had sort of figured out the way to get the liquor that they wanted to sell, and speakeasies were running like crazy, and I suppose in every city you probably knew where you could go, where the cops might break it up, where they wouldn't. You have federal agents running around the hills of anywhere that's rural looking for these undercover stills where they're making moonshine. And I guess you're not a moonshiner, but you are a brewer.
I am a brewer.
And found your way into this much later in life. Talk to me about your work as a brewer.
So I am the director of brewery operations. Fortunately, we hired a brewer that knows what he's doing. So I've been homebrewing for going on 15 years. Wound up meeting somebody at Dillard's, and we started brewing together when I got back in Little Rock. And one day walked into their house, and they tossed me a set of keys and said, "We're starting a brewery."
Well, so let's back up a little bit, because your background academically is nothing near this brewing that you find yourself doing these days. You have a PhD.
I could spin it.
You can do what?
I can spin it.
I'm sure you will. So you and I have a lot of conversations that I walk away from going, I'm glad I got to talk to Seth today. I don't know what we talked about necessarily, but you have a PhD in what?
Industrial engineering.
Okay. And I always tell people it's in like supply chain logistics or something like that. Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a component of supply chains where industrial engineers get involved. The business schools have picked up a lot of the supply chain management side, but really, like, I build and analyze systems. Mm-hmm. And so manufacturing is one of those, and so in the brewery, it's a manufacturing operation. And so looking at everything from the forecast, which when you're brand new doesn't exist, and so that's been a lot of fun, having no data and still having to make decisions, but through to how you have an efficient process. And one of the fun pieces of a craft brewery is that we have a lot of focus on quality and diversity of product. And so there's a level of like we're willing to give up a little bit of efficiency in order to produce something that is better or different.
Okay. So before you got into brewing, though, you worked for many years for Dillard's. That's based out of Little Rock, Arkansas, if people are familiar with that retailer. And you used to crack me up. You'd walk up to women that we knew, and you'd look at their shoes or their handbag, and you'd say, you got the Model 54A, which is made in Indonesia or whatever.
Yeah, there was a point when I had just started at Dillard's and been through the first fall when I walked into the Kroger on Chenal, and I had really a complete existential crisis where 16-year-old Seth was super disappointed because I could name the Ugg boots on every woman that walked by me. And I'm just going like, oh, that's a Bailey triple button in black. Oh, there's a Bailey Botal in chestnut.
So you have moved on beyond that type of retail and these days into something I think probably you're much more suited to dispositionally. So you are the director of brewing operations at one of our brand new breweries here in Little Rock, Southern Tail Brewing.
Yeah, so Southern Tail Brewing is locally owned, and there's only one location right now, and we've just started to do some light distribution to the restaurants and bars in your area. Here in Central Arkansas. Really, there's a focus on doing craft well across the whole business. And so our restaurant is a fully functional restaurant, like full menu. The brewery, we have 24 taps to fill, and 21 to 22 of those at any time would be beer. We also have a large event spaces to host events. We have a nice outdoor patio, a nice lawn, and we can a stage where we can have music. And then also a Jumbotron where you could come and watch, I don't know, the Super Bowl.
Okay. Is that an invitation?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
Well, I'll be there.
I'll take you up on that.
And so it's called Southern Tail. This is a very dog-friendly place, at least in your outdoor areas.
Right. Brett and Tracy Kreider, the founders and owners, are very into animals, and so they have, I think, 4 dogs and 4 or 5 cats. And so there's Craft with a Cause, which is a 501c3 nonprofit.
Okay.
And so a portion of the proceeds will go to supporting particularly people who are fostering and adopting dogs and cats so that there are fewer dogs and cats without homes.
Yeah, awesome. And it's a beautiful space. I have loved going down there a handful of times in the 3 months now that you guys have been open.
Since September, so.
Oh, wow. 4 months.
4.5, yep.
Always a good food, always a good environment to be in. And you've got a beer on tap called the Grumpy Old Don.
Bitter Old Don.
Bitter Old Don, doggone it. Tell me about Bitter Old Don.
So my dad is the worst gift receiver. Gift receiver in the history of the world. And he was working for T-Mobile, and he'd been up to Seattle and had an ESB there. And he kept coming to me and was like, you need to make an ESB. And we were making IPAs and stouts, basically trying to get high alcohol and lots of flavor for not a whole lot of money because we were broke grad students. And so one Father's Day, I decided, you know what, this is what we'll do for the man. I will brew an ESB.
What is an ESB?
It's an English Special Bitter.
Okay.
It's not as hoppy as like an IPA, but you use British hops.
Okay.
Which tend to be less fruity, right, than we might use in America, less resinous. It's a brown ale that is hoppier, right? So it's not a lager, and I've been told that when you walk into a pub in Britain, you order a lager or you order a bitter.
Okay.
And so I've had a few people like, hey, we can't find these, but when we were deciding what to name this beer to give him for Father's Day, we might have had a couple of them while we were naming them because you got to know how it tastes.
Sure.
We were like, you know what, let's name it Bitter Old Don, extra English Special Bitter, right?
Well, as a man who knows Don, it makes me really happy to be able to walk into your bar and order a Bitter Old Don, even though I usually go for something not quite so bitter, personally.
And now you can find his face on a shirt.
Is that right?
Yep. I should have worn it today, but yeah, he's on a shirt, and it's one of the few black shirts, maybe the only black shirt that we have for sale. And so it's like the server's favorite, and so it's really funny to walk around the restaurant and see my dad's face on the back of all the servers.
Well, I love that. And shout out to Don Borin. I don't know whether he'll listen to this or not. What do you think? Can we get Don to listen?
I mean, maybe while he's weed eating.
Okay. Well, come spring, maybe he'll check us out then. Well, you talked about what you got on most of those taps. Tell me this. Have you considered shining?
Well, it's a separate license, so we can't legally do it right now.
Okay. But come on, tell me, you're in your backyard making, you got a still out there, don't you? You got some potatoes.
You know, there's a level of what would go into acquiring the equipment that I have not gotten into. I do have friends who say it's pretty easy.
Fair enough. All right, well, even if you've got no experience making moonshine, or I guess bathtub gin either, we will still bring you on for the rest of this episode. Seth, I want to start by talking about Eduardo Risso's art. What do you think of it overall?
I really like it.
Yeah.
There's a simplicity to it. And like one of the first things I noticed was compared to some of the others, the colors are contrasted, but there are a minimal number of colors on every frame.
That's true.
Like 3 at most.
Yep.
I thought that was pretty cool. But all in all, like, it tells the story, but there's not a whole lot of complexity to it. So you're not like, is there something hidden? Like, I didn't feel like I should be looking for Easter eggs in like the corner of the frames.
Yeah, that's a good point. in preparing for this episode, I really thought a lot about Eduardo Risso's art style, because I'd never quite tried to put it into words before, what I liked about it or why it works for me the way it does. And I love his art. And it's really almost like he has two different art styles that he deploys sometimes on the same page, but certainly within the same issue. One is what I described before on that cover, where you get a lot of things that are in silhouette, they're backlit, and you get people that their figure is almost entirely in shadow. And that works really well because so much of this book is set in the woods at night, and it adds to the elements of the feel, I guess, of the book so much. But then you have these other types of images and pages that are more close up on people's faces and bodies. And in a lot of ways, I think some of those figures are a bit grotesque. And I don't mean gross, but what I mean is the heads and bodies are kind of exaggerated a little bit in some of their features. The heads are a little bit bigger, and I think that's a style choice. I don't think it's an art problem. I don't know, like if it were superhero art, I don't think I would want that necessarily. But in a story where everything is kind of grimy and kind of dirty, I like that a lot. But even where you have those types of things, and of course we'll have sample pages of both on our Instagram account for people to look at, but even where you've got that in the foreground, you still tend to have a lot of background that is more of that thin line shadow type that I like so well, or that just works so much for me.
It's good.
So one other thing I just want to say about that before we get into the story itself is, I mentioned before that Eduardo Risso is from Argentina. You've got two very distinct subcultures from historical periods in America that I got to imagine he did not grow up with in Argentina. The idea of what a 1920s bootlegger, from the big city would look like, with his pinstripe suits and the men's hats of the era, and the way they would wear those suits, even the shoes that it's almost like that modern bowling shoe type style. And then you've got these Appalachian hillbilly types as well, these backwoods people, and how they are dressed. And he did panel discussion. I say a panel discussion, it was really a one-on-one interview with him at Planet Comic-Con last year, and I went and listened to that. And so when they opened up for questions, one of the things I asked him was, how did you develop the sense of what their worlds should look like, and not only just their clothes, but just what the feel should be like, because I have to, think that was not something that was part of your upbringing. And, now in part, his English is good, but they did have a translator up there, and so he was using the translator. He was largely, you could tell he understood the question when asked in English perfectly, but then the translator was replying with his answer, and it ended up being something kind of along the lines of like, I'm a professional, I do a lot of research.
I watched Deliverance.
Yeah, right. Oh man. And I guess that made a lot of sense. I thought he might have something further to offer about how I never even knew these worlds existed, but he was like, no, I'm just a professional, I research these things. And I was like, well, I suppose that's a very good answer. All right, well, let's get into it. Chapter 1. I want to talk, and I know sometimes these things go long, and sometimes we get bogged down on just, the smallest detail. And you may get that dread right now as I tell you I want to talk in some detail about the first 3 pages. But I do, because I think they stand alone as like a little bit of a vignette almost that just sort of throw us right into this world without yet introducing the characters that we're going to follow. And we start out in the woods at night, and you've got, again, in shadow, these 3 figures who I'm going to presume are the same ones from the cover of issue 1. They're the FBI agents that are walking through the woods at night, and they've got axes for if they find a still, they've got lanterns, they've got shotguns, and they are out here in the woods just trying to find these illicit stills. And while they're doubtful that they're going to find one here in the hills of Spine Ridge, West Virginia, lo and behold, they do. They come across this still, they go in there and they get ready to start breaking it up with their axes. And then the next thing we see on the 3rd page, we get for the first time a splash of greater color. I mean, we had some blues in the background along with the light and the black and some yellow, but we start getting these splashes of color in the form of blood now, that something is attacking these three men. And we see some eyes that look like animal eyes, basically.
Yeah, no, I was really confused about what was going on at this point, because when I looked at the cover and you told me it was about moonshine, suddenly when there's a monster, page 3. And then what's funny is then when I downloaded on Hoopla, the cover art actually says whiskey and werewolves.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, but I want to know how these three guys who make it all of 3 pages also got the cover art.
Well, maybe because they were just so cool looking. I don't know. It is a good setting for us, though. But yeah, sure enough. So, we're not really introduced to this just yet, but these orange eyes that we see in a panel of otherwise blackness. And there's one panel where it looks like there's, you might call it fur, but we only have kind of a partial image of the back of this creature, whatever it is. We don't really know. You might look at that and go, I don't know what exactly I'm seeing here. But these guys get taken out, not because they're being shot, but I guess we'll learn. It's a werewolf.
You said spoiler alerts were fine.
I did.
Spoilers were fine.
I did.
Now, I did take a little offense to this. As somebody who comes from hillbillies on both sides of my family, that he refers to, they refer to this part of the country as God's sweaty butt crack.
Well, you need to take that up with those FBI agents, but I have a feeling they got their due. Well, once we get through that first 3-page vignette, we jump into the meat of our story here. And we are first introduced to Lou Perlow, who is our main character throughout this series. And while we've got gangsters, while we've got hillbillies, and we've got these werewolves, we also follow a lot of noir tropes throughout this book. And some of that comes in the form of a voiceover that Lou Perlow's character gives us. So he is, at some point in the future, apparently, telling us the story of what happened to him when he was down in West Virginia. Now, also interspersed with that, we are seeing the story happen in real time, but we're getting some of that explanation. But the patter that Brian Azzarello has written for it, like, I can hear it. Like you turn on a crime noir film, and, the little girl that we see who is waking Lou Perlow up at the beginning of this story and telling him that he's got his party is waiting for him on the phone out in the hallway at this little boarding house hotel that he's staying at. He says, my party like hell. This party was being thrown by the boss. Joe the Boss Masseria, to be specific. My boss. 4 days ago, Joe asked to see me. He said he had a job that I was qualified for. Up till then, I'd been getting by on my good looks and a Joe sent me card. And then it launches into this flashback sequence where we show Joe, the boss, giving this assignment to Lou Perlow. And there are a couple of times throughout this story where we'll go back to that voiceover narrative style that, I don't know, to me it just feels like this would be a black and white movie, with our detective figure. And there's some other tropes that we're going to go back to, including really this one at the very beginning where Lou Perlow is being woken up out of a drunken stupor to start the story. So often you have that smart-talking, hard-drinking protagonist in noir fiction. And very much that is Lou Perlow here, even though he's not, say, a detective.
He's definitely getting high on his own supply.
That's true. That's true. And as we first meet Lou Perlow, he's not exactly sure of what had occurred for him the night before. He just knows that he's in his hotel room now and that at some point he had started drinking.
At one point he says, and I drink.
Maybe that's a good way to put it. Well, we're going to learn pretty quickly here through Perlow's explanation that the boss of the outfit that he works for, Joe Masseria, had sent him down here to West Virginia to find a moonshiner named Hiram Holt, who apparently makes the best and just like smoothest liquor that Masseria had ever tasted. And so Perlow's objective here is going to be to track this guy down somewhere in the hills of West Virginia and strike up a deal with him. And you can imagine from what we'll see of Masseria, he's not a guy who cares to worry himself about the details of how these things get done. He just wants to hear that it is done, it has been done, and it was done on the terms that he dictated to begin with. And as you might guess, Hiram Holt is not going to be a wilting violet out here in the wilderness, but rather he's going to be a formidable character as well. And so he's not prepared to just take whatever deal this New York crime outfit wants to throw his way.
And Joe's a tough guy. He can spit snakes through the phone.
Yeah, we do get a little of that too. While Perlo is on the phone with his boss, he gets some, he's holding that kind of old-timey cup of the phone to his ear, and, we get some of those visual lines where we can see the yelling coming through the line.
I liked how Lou goes, it's hard to work for a crazy person. I understand that.
So one thing about Lou Perlo is he is who he is. This guy stands out in this small town, and he's not trying to fit in and act like certainly they're going to know he's not a local, but he's also not trying to act like he's from around here anywhere close. He's wearing his fancy New York suit. He goes into this little diner and he asks about getting pasta and gravy. And of course, they want to give him some biscuits and gravy.
I was so thankful that I'd watched The Sopranos because I knew exactly what he was talking about.
Oh, with pasta and gravy?
Pasta and gravy.
Yeah, he wants them to know that he is a big shot gangster from New York City. And because he doesn't have all of the other people in his normal outfit around him, he can really show himself off as the big shot or try and pass himself off that way. Well, after a little interaction with some of the locals in the city, including, and maybe he doesn't realize it at this point, but meeting the daughter of Hiram Holt, a woman named Tempest, who we're going to deal with quite a bit more in this series. But Perlo gets in his car and he drives out to Holt's property in the woods. And we have one of these scenes that I know we've seen this in movies before, and I kind of love it when we do. Perlo gets out of his car and he just starts talking to the guy who's standing on the front porch of this shack in the woods, and announces that he's here to talk to Hiram Holt. And the guy says, well, why don't you just tell me what your business is? Puts up like he's not going to give him access to Holt. And we'll discover pretty quickly that it's a bit of a ruse. He's trying to suss this guy out and feel him out a little bit. But that actually is Holt that he's talking to. He's a big man. He's got kind of, like I described before, like a little bit of a grotesque in that it's oversized head. And then he's got a great big scar right down his face.
Yeah, and I gotta think his voice is probably Billy Bob Thornton's from Sling Blade.
Oh man, this guy is chewing glass. There's no doubt about it. Well, while Lou is here at the Holt property, trying to make his first entree, basically, to the Holt family, we see something that you might expect to see in, you referenced Deliverance a minute ago. A character named Enos comes running out of the woods, and he's all stooped over, and he's covered in some kind of, I don't know, it's like mud or blood or something like that, and he's crying, and he runs right over to Tempest. He looks a little bit deformed in his character as well, I should say. He's running over to Tempest to be comforted, and he's saying, don't let Daddy be mad at me, or, whatever. My first thought here, I don't know if you reacted the same way, but my first thought was like inbreeding. This is going to be the character that's like the inbred son who, is kind of a danger because he's a wild card at all times.
Yeah, no, that's definitely where I was going. Like, oh, this is somebody whose family tree does not branch.
Now, you mentioned you come from a long line of hillbillies. Prevalent inbreeding?
Fortunately, there were enough of breeding outside of marriages happening that I think we're okay.
Okay, good. So during these negotiations that Lou is trying to have with Hiram, and there actually seems to be they're getting up a dialogue pretty fast. Hiram is a man who may be set in his ways, but he's also a man of business, and if he sees a business opportunity, while he's going to protect himself and his family and his operation, he's looking to make money. He's not doing the moonshining for the fun of it. But while they're sitting there talking, these couple of family members run in and say that there's a problem out at one of the stills. And Hiram uses this as an opportunity to make a very loud, very clear point to Lou, and really by proxy to try and make that point to the boss, Joe Masseria, back in New York. So Hiram invites Perlo to walk out to the still and see what's going on. And we get out there and we find those 3 FBI agents. And they're not just dead. Their bodies are like torn to pieces. They've got limbs missing. There's blood everywhere. And Hiram basically says, you come into these woods, sometimes these things happen when you mess with an operation like mine. And making it very clear that the New York outfit is not just going to muscle in on Holt's business out here in the woods.
Yeah, and he says, you're in the mountains, Lou. Mm-hmm, my mountains.
You do have your Billy Bob Thornton down good. By the way, one of our native-born sons here in Arkansas, Billy Bob. So to wrap up this first chapter, or the first issue, we've got Perlo driving away in the dark, and he gets a flat tire. And so he stopped and he's got to find some kind of help. And he starts just kind of wandering around in the woods. And he wanders into this area where he comes upon the property of a black family that's out there in the woods. Maybe needless to say.
He hears the siren song.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
He's drawn in by the music.
Yes, that's exactly right. He doesn't wander on it first with his eyes, but first with his ears. That's right. He hears this music and he finds that this family is out there and they've got a campfire going and they're in their yard. And, there's a guy with a harmonica and a guy with a guitar and they're playing and people are dancing. And we see one young woman in the frame as well who seems to catch the eye of Lou Perlow, who's, I think, has a way of probably stumbling into trouble. And this young woman is a daughter in the family named Delia. We don't get her name here, but we'll come to know her much more. So we don't exactly see what happens just next, but chapter 2 opens up the following day, and we see these black boys who are, 6, 7, 8 years old, and they're playing down in this creek. They're chasing a snapping turtle around, and they come across the body of a dead black man that has been torn to pieces, like rib cage exposed, all this kind of thing. However it was that this man came to die, it looks like something in the woods has gotten a hold of him either before or after that point.
It was not at human hands.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. So once again, we've got Joe, who somehow or other has made it back to town, and he's being woken up by some kids. He's in his car in the middle of the street, and of course he's drunk. And these kids are waking him up, and they're like, "Why are you here in the middle of the street?" And he says, "I guess I was done driving," which is, kind of some of that noir, like, smart talk patter, that you get. Well, Sheriff Kelly, who's the sheriff of this town, is going to show up here at Perlow's room. And this is another noir trope that we're going to see in this issue, which is your hero ends up being acted upon for the story to advance. That is, he'll get to a point where he's just minding his own business, and then someone comes in and takes him out of his hotel, or someone comes in and wakes him up out of his sleep, or whatever. And that's how we advance the plot forward. And that's going to happen a couple of times here in this issue. So you've got Sheriff Kelly, who's showing up at Perlow's room, and he starts to question him about this dead man that had been found out in the woods. And he says that Lou was the last person who had been seen with this guy, and they'd been seen walking off in the woods together. And as they're having this conversation, Sheriff Kelly is looking down and notices there's like mud all over Perlow's shoes. Well, Sheriff Kelly no sooner leaves the room, but Joe goes into his bathroom and he's going to try and start collecting himself. And he looks down, and there on the floor is the badge of one of those FBI agents. And, of course, he picks this up. He's terrified. He's like, oh my goodness, the chief of police, or the sheriff rather, could have walked into this bathroom and this thing was just laying there on the floor, and he doesn't know why he has it. And he hasn't even gotten a chance to collect his thoughts about that before two of the adult sons from the Holt family, just make their way on into Lou's room as well. And they take him out of there. And they've got some place they want to carry him off to in the woods that they've got a proposition for.
Well, Andy's got to talk to his boss, Joe, in between. He's a brief conversation.
Yeah, right. More or less, like, Joe wants to know, why haven't you gotten this whole thing wrapped up already?
He says, you need help? And Lou goes, no.
Yeah, that is a bit of a recurring idea that we get through this, that Lou Perlow is, I think he recognizes that he's a small fish in that operation. And he recognizes that nobody trusts him to get a job done and get it done right. And that this is an opportunity for him. And we'll see actually a little bit later in the story, maybe going back to Lou's childhood even, why it is that nobody trusts him to do anything right. And maybe why he sees himself as a bit of a screw-up. And this is his chance. And it's like every time he pulls his head up for air, his boss is breathing back down his throat saying, I'm about to send some more guys down there to help you get this job done because you're not doing it fast enough. With no appreciation whatsoever for all that Lou has to do to make this happen.
And meanwhile, he's getting blackout drunk on the regular, which is not helping him.
That's true. He has impaired judgment a lot of the time as well. That is also true. Well, these Holt boys that show up at the room, it's Fry and Tucker. And Fry is Hiram's son. Tucker is someone who is married into the family, but he's just one of the boys as well. And they are joined in this little hunting cabin by their sister Tempest. And we're going to learn eventually that Tempest is also not the natural daughter of Hiram, but rather she and Enos, who we met before, were adopted into the family a long time ago. But they'd grown up with Hiram as their dad and with the Holt family as their family. But, you know, they say blood is thicker than water, but I guess here it's that money can speak louder than the blood sometimes, because the Holt boys and Tempest as well are wanting to make their own separate deal with Lou Perlo and the New York outfit. They feel like their dad is stuck in his ways, that he's missing a good thing when he sees it, and they kind of, you know, they're tired of being the muscle. They want to be the boss. They want to sit in Hiram's seat. And so they offer to make a deal on the side. Now, Lou is not too keen for this right away, because he says, it sounds like what you're talking about is like skimming some liquor here and there off the top. And we think your liquor is such a good product that we want truckloads of this stuff running into New York all the time. We don't want the one barrel that you could set aside here and there for us.
They're talking about like small fry stuff, right?
Right.
Hey, we can send a little bit here and there, and Joe is not going to go for this, right?
Right. Masseria wants volume. They want to make a show of good faith, though, and so they propose to Lou, well, how about we drive a truck of this moonshine out of here tonight and back to New York City? And so Lou goes for it. We see maybe there's some opportunity here. So we get Tucker driving the truck and Lou riding shotgun, although he's not carrying a shotgun like traditionally would have been done for the person in that seat. Rather, he's got himself a jar of moonshine, and he's drinking as Tucker is bounding along down the lanes of these woods, and he's driving like crazy out of control. And Tucker ends up crashing, and Perlo is thrown from the vehicle, and he's knocked out. Well, he wakes up, comes to a minute or two later, and he finds Tucker, who's just a short distance away, and he's begging for his life from a werewolf. And this is the first time we have actually seen a full-on werewolf. We talked about seeing eyes before, seeing a bit of fur. And if you didn't know, if you hadn't picked up a volume that said a Whiskey and Werewolves on the cover, and you were just reading issue number 1 of this comic, not with anything more than this being some Prohibition-era gangster story as your foreknowledge, I think this could be pretty shocking right here.
Yeah, and we get a big red crunch.
That's right.
Followed by a guy that only has half a head.
Yeah.
And it's side to side. It's not even top and bottom.
Right. Yeah, this werewolf, Tucker is not going to be a recurring character after this point, I think it's fair to say. And Perlo sees this, and he just runs off into the woods. And he's running for his life, and, he knows he saw something beyond his explanation. He knows he saw something that looked like a monster that was there in the woods. I'm sure at this point, first of all, he's half drunk. He's got almost no sleep. He's in a place that is completely foreign to him in the wilderness. And he's just running and running along. And eventually he runs himself off this embankment and falls into a river. But he's able to, just gasp for enough air and grab at things and flail around that he's able to pull himself to the side of the shore where he falls asleep right there. And he's discovered the next morning by Delia and a couple of the children from that black family.
Yeah, I like the last 2 frames of issue 2 because they are the exact same, but the first one is just 3 kids staring at him, and then in the last one, Delia slides in, and we're going to learn more about, kind of who she is and the power she has later, and I thought that was kind of cool. On the second read, like to see her slide into frame.
Yeah, so the kids discover this man who's half drowned on the shore of the creek there, and they don't run and get like a patriarch from the family. And we'd seen some older men who had been out there by the campfire playing the guitar and that kind of thing, but the person they run to is Delia, for sure.
Banjo, but that's...
Oh, I beg your pardon, a banjo. Well, we go into chapter 3, and we're not going to realize it for a couple of pages, but what we are seeing here is a nightmare that Perlo is having, where the sky is all red, and he's in that dark woods, and we get a full moon, and he is running, and he's being chased by something that looks like that figure of a werewolf. And as we get to the second page of this chase, and he is tripped, and he's starting to tear up with tears in his eyes and saying, "Please don't hurt me," he looks up at this werewolf that's over him, and it's his own head and face on the body of the werewolf.
Oh! I did not recognize that as his own face, and I was like... Okay.
Sure enough. Well, and at the first I didn't either. I thought it might have been Enos, which, by the way, we'll figure out sooner or later here that Enos is also a person who transforms as a werewolf, which explains why, when we first saw him running out of the woods up to Tempest. And I said, like, I figured this was like an inbreeding character or something like that, that he was like transforming back from being a werewolf. And surely he's the reason why those 3 FBI agents were dead. And he was in such a panic about, what Daddy was going to do when he
find out that's kind of his regular job too, right?
Well, it is. Yeah, at one point he's given the task, like, guard the still.
Which now may not be the time to talk about this, but whatever happened to werewolves and full moons?
Okay,
so can they? I still don't know. Maybe this is down the line, but like it seems like they can change when they want to.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you're right, and I don't know in this particular mythology. I mean, the whole story takes place over a period of a couple of days, and so you can have a full moon that certainly lasts.
Well, I
long.
looked this up because I'm neither an astronomist nor an astrologist, and
an
a
astronomist.
perfect
I don't
full
think
moon
anybody...
only lasts 2 minutes. And because I was like, oh, maybe it'll stretch across multiple days. But anyway,
maybe you only need the better...
I was looking for what the mechanism was, right? Like,
yeah.
There's always some sort of mechanism that's outside of the control of the werewolf.
Sure.
Anyway, maybe we'll find out later.
No, that's all right. Did you get a chance to listen to the episode that we did with my buddy Jake Jones, where we did the midnight show? It was the Universal Monsters rampaging around the small city. Jake...
Wolfman's got nards. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Jake talked about the werewolf being his favorite monster, and one of the observations he made was two of them. First, that, a vampire's going to come up and try and seduce you and then bite into your neck when you're not looking. Whereas a werewolf, man, it's just teeth and claws and fur coming at you, and it's just going to knock your head clear off your body. And that's what we see here. So the viciousness of the werewolf. But the other thing he pointed to was the sadness of the character, the werewolf. And I think he even had tied this back to something maybe Lon Chaney had said. Maybe it was Boris Karloff, but I think it was Lon Chaney had said about the werewolf being the saddest character because he doesn't necessarily want to be a monster. He can't control it. It just happens to him. But here it does seem that the werewolves in this mythology here, in the world of Moonshine, have some degree of control over their changing. But maybe not completely. So after a couple of pages, though, of this nightmare, we have Lou, just taking a big gasp of air and waking himself up and finding himself in another very foreign surrounding. He has been put to bed in this shack that's there on the property of this black family. And I wish I had another way to refer to them aside from this black family, but that's what distinguishes them from the Holt family, and we're not given their name. So Lou gets out of his bed, and he goes out, and he finds Delia, and she explains that they'd found him, and that they'd put him to bed, and they'd try to dress his wounds and that kind of thing. And you can tell from this scene that there is a romantic spark of some kind between these two. Certainly on Lou's side. Now, Delia is much more guarded about that, and so I don't know that you fully see it here, but I think we will come to see that she did sort of fall for this guy right away.
I mean, and that's Lou's role, is to seduce people, right? Like, in the crime organization, that was his role.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe not, seduce somebody and then kill them or something like that, but that he was sort of the glad-hander guy. He said back in New York they called him Handsome Lou. And so he was the guy that, you'd put out to schmooze the other people that you were trying to do business with or take money from or whatever.
And I'm sure you understand his problem, right? Like, just being so incredibly good looking that people don't take you seriously.
I do. It's been a heavy cross to bear. I've had to overcome a lot of things in my life for how good I look, for how attractive I am, but...
You're very strong, Mark.
Well, I don't get to talk about it a whole lot, and so thank you. I appreciate you bringing that out, Seth.
You're welcome.
Well, never one to be left alone for any period of time, Perlo goes back to town and to his room, and of course he's not just going to find a quiet bed that he can lay himself down there in his hotel room, but rather, I guess the boss got impatient, and Massera has sent some more mob guys down there to help him get the job done, send him some backup, and there are a group of these guys, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of them, but there are really 3 main guys that we're going to get to know. The one who seems to be sort of the spokesman for them all is a guy called Ducky. And then we've got 2 guys named Tony. Fat Tony and Other Tony.
Yeah, I laughed out loud when it was Other Tony.
I like that too, because it's really like capital O, capital T. They don't just address him as Tony. They say, hey, Other Tony, come over here and get these guns or whatever.
Fat Tony had it rough in junior high.
I got to imagine so. And people who called him Fat Tony when he didn't like it probably had it rough as adults, because he's a rough character.
So without being asked for,
Yeah.
Lou now has people from his organization that he has to work at least kind of with.
Yeah, and it's not like these are soldiers who have been sent to be under his command. Really, they are here to undermine him, to get the job done, but to sort of push him to the side. And, I guess he's established some relationship with Hiram already, so he's going to have a role to play, but he ain't in charge. I think Ducky is going to be the one calling the shots here.
But he doesn't want to go back anyway after his experience.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these mob guys are ready to just, jump in the car and drive on out to the Holt property, and our man Lou Perlow wants nothing to do with that. And in fact, not only does he want nothing to do with that, he decides that it is a scary enough proposition to go back out there that it is worth it to him to leave his whole life behind. And he grabs up whatever he can, his suitcase and stuff, and excuses himself from the room and goes down a back stairway and jumps in his car and just takes off. Like, forget Massera, forget the Holts. I'm going to drive out of this county and, maybe I'll make my way down to whatever is south of West Virginia, and that'll be my new home,
Yeah, even the sheriff says, "Can I have a word with you, Mr. Perlow?" And he says, "One, Sheriff Kelly." No.
He jumps in his car and yells no. I do love that, too. And he's trying to get out of town, and, of course, you always got to cross a bridge to get out of town, and that's a good choke point. And he gets there, and he finds that some of Holt's boys are waiting for him there. And so they're like, get in the car. And at this point, I think it's kind of neat. You've got Lou, who was so panicked that he was ready to just leave everything behind and be on the run from the mob. And now the Holt boys catch him, and he sees that he's cornered, and he's sort of resigned. He just accepts. Like he says, he doesn't even ask where they're taking him. He just gets in the car and is riding along, I'm sure, as he assumes, to his death. And death is certainly in the air, because where they take him is to this graveyard where the rest of the Holt family is in the middle of having a funeral for Tucker. And they're there at the graveside. And at one point, they start beating up Lou, and they've got him down in Tucker's hole in the ground. The casket hadn't been lowered into it yet. And so Perlow finds himself standing there inside a open hole in the ground with guns pointed at him. And in fact, Fry, maybe realizing that, whatever explanation they might have given for why Tucker was driving off into the night with this truck full of booze, if Perlow has an opportunity to speak, the jig might be up for Fry and for Tempest. And so Fry is ready to just kill this guy right away and make it look like it's because he's so mad about Tucker being dead. But Hiram, whether sensing something is going on or not, he headbutts Fry and tells him, "You're not going to kill somebody at a funeral. We're just not doing that." So Lou's life is spared for the moment, at least. And he's taken back to Hiram's house.
Well, but first...
Yeah, please.
Before he gets back, he crafts this story, right? About like, look, I'm a businessman. I had an opportunity. Tucker came to me with a proposition, and he leaves out Fry and Tempest from the whole story.
That's right. That's an important point that I let go.
His smooth talking comes through and actually helps him in this case, whereas it seems about 50-50 whether or not he's digging himself a deeper grave or pulling himself out of one.
Yeah, that's right. He's got a couple of choices he can make here, and one is to make, hopefully, allies of Tempest and Fry, that they can protect him by protecting them. And then the other is to call out Tempest and Fry and hope that that puts him in the good graces of Hiram. But then again, it might not, because Hiram might not believe him. You can't always believe the things that are coming out of the mouth of a man standing in an open grave.
Right.
So I think he probably makes the wise choice, but you're exactly right.
And then I also wanted to... That's all it took for Tucker's wife to spit on his casket.
That's true. The fact that he'd betrayed the family.
Not on your husband's casket, Lizzie. Ain't right.
Yeah, that's right. So Lou is taken back to Hiram's house, and he's offered a drink. He might have thought that he was in the clear at this point, but he's plainly not, because he starts to take a little sip out of this bottle of moonshine, and they say, no, that's not what we're talking about. And next thing you know, Fry is holding Lou down, and he's got a funnel that he's sticking in his throat, and you've got Hiram coming into the room with this big jar of moonshine, and they're just pouring it straight down Lou's throat. But we go into this dream space again with that red kind of background like we did at the beginning of, was it this issue or issue 2? Either way, we go into this dream space and we find out a little bit more about Lou's childhood. He had a sister named Annabelle, and at one point he had built a little raft and he let her play in it. And that raft capsized and he wasn't able to get out to her in time, and she drowned and died.
She stood up. Right? One thing she was not supposed to do.
Are we blaming the little girl here for her own death?
I mean, as the oldest of 5 boys,
Did you put your brothers in some dangerous situations and then get in trouble when that didn't work out well for them?
I mean, somebody had to test the bike ramp. We needed the one that could generate the most speed and also the least amount of inertia when they hit, that ramp.
I told you to pull up on the handles. Well, Lou goes into this dream world where he is reliving that scene in his mind, and he sees Annabelle, his sister, who he calls Belle most of the time, in that raft, and she's calling out for him, and she's drawn differently and colored a little more brightly than everything else that's in this scene. I actually think she sort of looks like a Dr. Seuss character a little bit, the way she's drawn, and she's going to appear a few more times. What we'll see is that even when he is awake, and Lou is going to wake up here coughing blood in just a second, but even when he's awake, he still sees his sister. He's kind of haunted by her. Maybe when things are at his worst, maybe when he's drunk. I don't really know, when she appears to him. But he can see and hear her. And what's kind of cool too is the way she's depicted is that although she is in full color, she's also transparent. You can see the moon behind her.
Translucent?
Through her. Translucent, yes. I think that's right.
Engineer, I don't do words, but
Well, you did hear. But the last thing, upon waking up from this dream, that Lou is going to see on a splash page at the end of chapter 3 is Belle telling him, "You're drowning in blood." And he looks around, and he's in Hiram Holt's front yard, and there are shot-up cars, there are dead gangsters in their pinstripe suits, there are dead hillbillies in their overalls, there are guns laying on the ground. But some of these bodies also don't look like they are the victims of gunshots. Take, for example, just the pair of legs and gore that we find at the bottom of the screen there.
That was definitely my question. Was this werewolf or was this human?
Yeah, and I think we've got reason to suspect that there's, a little bit of both going on here. I mean, we see bullet holes in the sides of the cars, but we also see on the roof of one of the cars these big claw marks, basically, that had gone through it. And so it looks like we had both werewolf and human actors. Well, as we move into chapter 4, Lou is still in this same place here in the front yard, and he's starting to kind of collect himself and get his bearings a little bit. And he's going to have a quick conversation with Holt's wife, who has come out, and he asks where Hiram is, because there are no identifiable characters that we have seen that have been shot down in this shootout or confrontation, whatever it was that had happened. Hiram's wife says, well, Hiram has gone and he's chasing after the remaining gangsters, the people from New York who are left. So he asks, am I free to leave here after he knows that, anyone who's here is dead and Hiram's gone off to chase the other gangsters? She says, yeah, he's free to leave. You're supposed to. And he says, great, can I take one of these cars? And he gets an answer pretty quick.
She shoots out his tires.
Yeah, so I guess he's going on foot. So we've got Lou walking through the woods, and he's terrified, obviously. And as he's walking around, he stumbles into our 3 recognizable New York gangsters and a couple of their guys as well. So he runs into Ducky, Fat Tony, and Other Tony. And the gangsters start filling Lou in on this shootout that had taken place at Holt's house. Now, they don't say anything about a werewolf, but they're just telling him the story about this shootout going on. And as they do, Lou looks past them, and we see a werewolf sort of lingering in the background. And he doesn't linger for long because he dives on and just starts chewing up one of those gangsters. He nearly kills Fat Tony. It's chasing Fat Tony down, and he trips and he falls. And then Ducky pulls out a gun and mows down the werewolf with like a Tommy gun. And we don't really see anything more here of what happens to that werewolf after it's shot down. Well, next thing we know, we're back at the hotel, and Delia shows up, and she has a message that she wants to bring to Perlo. She tells Lou that his sister had come to her in a dream last night. And, we also know there's no reason on earth that Delia should know that Lou even has a sister, much less, it was this little girl who had died in her youth. And she says, "Your sister told me to give this to you." And she pulls out this folding knife and hands it to him. And then she starts to cry, and she kisses Lou on the cheek, and she says that she hopes he'll be all right, and then leaves. And so, I don't know, a bit of mystery going on here, what this could be about. But we certainly are understanding that, okay, Delia has some kind of premonition. She has some kind of access to magic or something like that. So, at the same time, Lou also learns that he has a note that has been delivered to his hotel, and it's from Tempest. And it tells him to meet her out at Holt's hunting cabin, where they had that first meeting with Fry and Tempest and Tucker. And so he goes out there, and he's expecting to find Tempest waiting for him. But instead, he gets in, and he finds Enos waiting for him in the cabin. And they start to fight. And so Enos and Lou are, throwing fists at one another, and the fight is going on, and it's getting more intense. And as it does, Enos starts to grow out some claws. He kind of begins the transformation of becoming a werewolf, but doesn't complete that transformation before Tempest comes in and breaks up the fight. And so we realize that, I guess Enos is one of these werewolves that's out there in the woods. And you asked before about the idea that we don't know exactly what causes them to transform and when. And who knows, maybe this suggests to us that there's some kind of like survival mechanism, that he's in this fight, his adrenaline is up, Enos is feeling threatened, and he starts to transform. But whatever it is, fortunately, he doesn't come all the way into his werewolf shape.
Like, is he Incredible Hulk style?
Ooh, he's angry.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we never do get that answer. Well, after this fight and the at least partial transformation, Enos is left to rest there, while Tempest and Lou go outside and they make a campfire, and they're cooking some meat over the fire. And of course, they get out some moonshine, and Tempest gets Lou drunk. And after she does, she strips naked, and she leads him off into the dark woods. And that's how we end chapter 4.
And he strips naked too, which I thought was kind of weird. Like, she didn't ask him to, but he could have worn his clothes.
Yeah, you're right. You're following a strange woman off into the woods. Maybe you're excited for what might be, but at the same time, you probably want to at least hang on to your shoes so that you can run if you have to.
Exactly.
Well, we begin with issue 5, and we see that they have had a romantic encounter out there in the woods. And at some point during it, Tempest had bitten Lou's lip and drawn some blood. Whether that's significant or not, I don't really know, but he kind of objects to it at the time. And at some point, we also see the image of werewolf eyes watching, and we see the full moon as well. So Lou wakes up under the tree the next morning out here still in the wilderness, and Hiram has found them, and he's not happy. He begins to smack them both around. Tempest is at least dressed at this point, but poor Lou is still, naked as he came into this world, and being beaten to the ground by Hiram, who is a huge man. Next thing Lou knows, he's being awakened by water being dumped on his head, and he finds himself not in the woods anymore, but he is now in a barn on the Holt property, and he's chained up. He's got this chain around his ankle that's holding him in place. And Lou tells him, "I gave you lots of opportunities to leave here, and you didn't take any of them, and now you never will." And Hiram closes the door to this barn and leaves Lou alone, chained up, naked, in the dark, realizing that this could be the last day of his life. Terrifying situation.
And as he sits there naked, of course his sister shows up.
Yeah, well, yes. So he covers himself, but yeah, the ghost of his sister appears to him a little bit, and he's trying to talk to her. And, you can tell he's kind of at his wit's end. He doesn't know what's going on exactly. And there's some voice that says something to him about, he's being visited not by an angel, but by a witch. And it's hard to make out exactly what all is going on there.
Then Enos shows up.
Yeah, Enos shows up and is sort of threatening to him and says, look, if it were up to me, I would kill you right now. But fortunately, it's not up to me. And there's this bit of dialogue where Lou says, well, I guess that's my silver lining, that it's not up to you. And then he just kind of pauses a moment and says, silver. And Enos turns and walks out of the barn. And so, of course, we know that silver bullets are what you use on werewolves, at least if we're in normal mythology. And I think back, or I can't help but thinking back to that knife that Delia had brought to Lou. Of course, Lou doesn't have it right now. He's naked. His clothes, I guess, are in this barn, but he doesn't have access to them. But he got his mind at least thinking about silver, like how do I kill a werewolf?
And I like how after everything that's happened, the thing that really irks Lou is that the hillbilly laughed at him.
Yeah, that's right. He was laughed at. But, he talks about how he's been laughed at his whole life. I mean, his inferiority complex is an important part of his character. Well, the day passes on, and as we turn the camera's focus elsewhere, we're back in town at this little bar, I guess, that these New York mobsters seem to have completely taken over. And there are even more of them now. Apparently, Joe has sent in even more reinforcements, and these guys have this place full up.
They look like real Italians, too.
Yeah, that's right. And then, suddenly we see some Italian being spoken, in there. And we've got one guy who's actually never going to speak a word of English, who's introduced as well. This figure, who is very cool looking, has got this sort of newspaper boy's cap on. He's got a very rough looking face and a heavy mustache. And he's wearing a bandolero over his chest. And he's got a shotgun in his hands as well. And he's speaking there in Italian. And nobody really, except this one guy, seems to know who he is even. So the other gangsters are asking about him, like, who is this guy? And we're told that he is Il Cacciatore. Italian speakers out there, please forgive me if I've said that completely wrong, but I read it as Il
Cacciatore.
Cacciatore. Maybe that's it. But that is Italian for the hunter. And we will see this character again. I didn't notice him the first couple of times I'd read through this, being introduced here, or as him being anybody special. But we'll see. He seems to have some either additional level of ruthlessness, or maybe even some additional skill or knowledge.
And he looks like a vampire.
He does kind of look like a vampire a little bit.
He's got the widow's peak, the white hair, like the
no.
kind of long pointy nose, right?
Well, so that's a different guy. That's the guy who is introducing.
Oh, Lago.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
So this is a character named Lago, he kind of looks like Roger Stone a little bit. He's got those round-colored glasses, and you're right, the widow's peak with the white hair and all this kind of stuff, and he's wearing, a bow tie, and he's got a white scarf around his big black overcoat that he's wearing. But it seems like these are the two who really mean business, maybe above and beyond the rest of your, run-of-the-mill Fat Tony and other Tony-type characters.
They're all clearly afraid of these newcomers.
Yeah, that's right. Or they know that it gives them a certain reverence at the very least. Well, the day has passed on, and as we go back out to that barn where we last left Lou Perlo, he had apparently been unconscious for the better part of the day. And he is awakened, and he's awakened in probably the grossest way, which is there is a werewolf in the barn with him that drools into his mouth from over on top of him. But Lou wakes up, and what he discovers, that werewolf is gone, but what he discovers is that his chain has been broken. The lock has been undone, and he can leave. And so he finds some clothes, gets himself dressed, and he sees his sister now outside of the barn, and she's leading him out into the woods. And so, he's not in good shape at this point. I mean, so little sleep, drunk all the time. He's not hardly eating. He's been beaten, and he's now looking like kind of feverish, and he's chasing the ghost of his sister through the woods until he encounters Tempest. And he's on his knees in front of Tempest, and he's trying to say, What did you do to me? I didn't want any of this. And Tempest is telling him, no, you wanted all of this. You knew what you were getting yourself into here. And, it's a little vague about what that is exactly. But we also see at about this same time, we've got a couple of truckloads full of these Holt boys, and they are armed to the teeth, and they are driving into town, apparently for a showdown with the gangsters.
We're left to the last page of chapter 5, where Tempest has her hands on a werewolf's head, right? And below is Delia in the bottom frame. And all I could think of was the Oak Ridge Boys trying to love two women.
Well, the Oak Ridge Boys don't make an appearance here, but we do have the two women who are going to be heavy influences in Lou's life going forward, it seems. And I interpret this where Tempest has her hand on the head of a werewolf to be Lou.
Lou, yeah.
And we also get just like a little box, a little image box kind of inset in the middle of the page that shows the full moon with the clouds parting in front of it. So we go into chapter 6, and we start with seeing that full moon rising again over the town and hearing the howling of a wolf in the distance. And we see a couple of these gangsters that are standing outside of that bar where all of the other New York guys are in there making their plans and getting ready. And they see a light. Well, this light is not the moon. It's nothing but the vehicles driven by the Holt boys coming down on them fast. And they just unload and start shooting. And we're going to have a big shootout right there in the street in front of the bar where the gangsters had been hanging out. And in the course of this, it is kind of chaos. This is, Seth, some of the thing you talked about at the beginning of our episode here, where you said, yeah, there was all this chaos going on. And, we commented how, there are a lot of pages where there's not hardly any dialogue. It's just action. And you're trying to follow the story of what's going on.
Well, and with the new gangsters in town, I'm like who's in that truck? It could be infighting.
Yeah, it certainly could be. Although we had seen the Holt guys driving out of the woods toward the end of chapter 5. I'll tell you though, at first I had mistaken that for being gangsters driving into the woods. And I guess maybe I just assumed that's where the big shootout was going to happen. Well, these gangsters start jumping into some of the cars and chasing the Holt boys back into the woods. So we had a shootout in town. We're going to have a shootout on the highway. We're going to have a shootout in the woods as well. And it's just going everywhere. And while all that is going on, we get like a half-page panel where we see, I'm not going to try the Italian again, where we see the hunter just kind of walking by himself. And he's got his rifle, and he's got like this giant knife on his hip and his bandolero. And so, I don't know, there's just something to me that says this guy means business, right? Well, as all of this is happening, we also see Delia walking back into the woods, and we don't exactly know where in relation to everything else that's happening, and we don't know for what purpose, but all these things are coming on at once.
And we have Tempest talking about how her and Lou were meant to be.
That's right.
Now cut back to fight scene, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we see Fat Tony get shot. Now, he's not killed here, it doesn't look like, or at least not immediately, but he's down for sure. And the two trucks full of Holt guys, I guess, get split up somewhere along the way. There was one that Fry was riding in. He was riding in the passenger seat, and the driver had gotten shot in the neck. And so Fry had to slide in and take over driving of that vehicle. And so it looks like something in the Holt plan had gone astray. We learned pretty quickly that this was part of the plan, that the Holts wanted the gangsters to try and trail them back into the woods, and Hiram was going to be back there with a shotgun, waiting as they came around a curve in the woods to take them all out. Well, we've got Fry driving one of those vehicles. As he does, he's looking backward at the car full of gangsters behind him that is shooting at him. That's his primary concern. Well, we get these little panels kind of here and there interspersed. We see that Lou is now fully changed into a werewolf, and we see him lurking in the woods. We see him howling at the moon. We see Tempest back by the still, and she's like sort of speaking to him from a distance almost, and she says, "You can smell me." And it drives you wild. And he's out there, going literally wild in the forest. Well, in the middle of this shootout, Fry turns his attention from the guys who are driving behind him and shooting at him back to the road. And at the last second, he sees that there is a giant werewolf right in the middle of the road in front of him. And he cuts his wheel real hard to avoid crashing into this, huge hulking werewolf. And in doing so, actually drives off the road right into the spot where Hiram had been waiting and crashes the car. And Hiram isn't killed or anything, but he's like pinned down underneath the wheel of this vehicle that's now, crashed on the side of the road. And all the vehicles stop that have been involved in this chase, and everybody starts pouring out of their cars, and we get this big shootout going on. And in the midst of it, Fry realizes he can't pull Hiram out from underneath this vehicle, at least not in a way that can be safe for him. And he also, I think there's something in his mind where he's saying, I want to take over this family business anyway. This is an opportunity, And he flees through the woods and leaves Hiram there. And of course, these gangsters then start to close in on Hiram. As they do so, they're walking up to him and they're starting a little bit of trash talk. And, we get our character Ducky, who had been sort of the spokesperson for the gangsters all throughout. And he is leaning over Hiram, getting ready to make a little speech. And the next thing you know, we see a panel of a werewolf with blood all over his claws. And we hear the roar. And we see Ducky's head just bouncing off to the side of the page.
Yeah, didn't see that coming from a werewolf. Everybody else got their head bit half off, so complete decapitation. This dude's been a werewolf for not very long, and he's already leveled up.
Oh, he's figured out the werewolf powers. And as we go on, we'll see on the next couple of pages that a bunch of these gangsters are going to meet their end here at the hands of Lou the werewolf. And some of those are in that more traditional way, where he's biting through their heads.
Yeah, right through their back of their heads, through their eye sockets.
That's
canines.
Pretty gross. Yeah.
Claw right through the face, the front of the face.
Yep. So one of these gangsters is hiding under a car, and he's able to get a shot off at the werewolf, and it goes through his shoulder. And so Lou, in his werewolf form now, is hurt. And he sort of flees the scene. He runs off into the woods. And you've got Hiram still laying there, pinned down by the car tire. And the hunter walks in, and he places his rifle barrel right up to the side of Hiram's head. And then we turn the page, and we are in a completely different scene.
Yep.
We don't see Hiram get shot. We don't hear a blam. We don't see whether there's any conversation between the hunter or Hiram. And we are about running out of pages here in Volume 1, and we are not going to get any resolution on what happens to Hiram at this point. So we switch our focus now instead to this pentagram circle that has been made out in the middle of the woods with a campfire on each of the points of the pentagram, and we have Delia standing in the center of it, and she hears a growling in the woods and sees a pair of eyes and says, "You don't scare me. I have magic." Well, while you might think there's a werewolf about to approach, it's not. But rather, it is Tempest. And she comes out of the woods and she says, "What you got is hocus pocus. What I got is beguiling." And we have a bit of a standoff. And Tempest tells Delia, "You're about to die."
And Delia has the knife.
That's it.
Or at least a knife.
Well, and we can see pretty clearly it looks to be that same knife that once had been in Lou's possession. And in fact, we had seen a few pages back where Delia, I think, had gone into that barn where Lou's clothes were, where he'd been chained up, and she had picked up that knife off the ground.
Yeah.
So she's got this knife and she's holding it out. We've got this standoff between these two women. But while that's going on, Lou, as werewolf, just kind of comes crashing out of the trees and drops to the ground. And Delia is looking at him, and she's holding the knife out, and Tempest has sort of faded back into the woods. And so Delia knows that this werewolf in front of her is Lou, and she starts talking to him, and she says, "I know what you want me to do, but dark things are in motion. I gave this knife to protect you from them. but you have left your misery up to me. And I'm sorry, Lou. So sorry. And she folds the knife back up and just drops it on the ground. And she is not going to kill him and put him out of his misery. And on the very last page of this volume, she's crying, and we see Lou has transformed back into his human form, and he is laying on the ground with Delia just holding him in her arms. And that's the end of book 1. So, like, no resolution.
Yeah, this is the kind of story that Casey absolutely hates.
Okay, tell me why. Casey, your wife.
Yes, yeah. She likes everything to be tied up. It doesn't have to be a beautiful ending, but she likes to have an ending. So, like Coen Brother movies, she's like, fine, we can watch them. But I normally am like, oh, it's all good. And until I realized that I was going to actually have the rest of them, I was a little bit the same. And then I realized, like, oh, I could, after we talk about this, I'm just going to go read the rest of it.
Yeah, if this series had gotten canceled after 6 issues, if it hadn't sold well enough or whatever, and they didn't get to tell the rest of their story, I think we'd be left feeling like, what? Because it was such a fun journey to go on, but you need the destination after the journey.
Well, and I feel like the real story is about to start, and I'm curious to see whether it is a werewolf mobster in New York,
right,
or if it's going to stay in Appalachia.
That's right. And you have sort of these paired off camps that are vying for the love, maybe for the soul, for the control, perhaps, of Lou, where you've got Tempest on one side with her beguiling, and you've got the magic of Delia on the other side. And, I mean, we don't know how the magic of either of them really works at this point.
It's like a ball and chain. Sometimes the pleasure ain't worth the pain. It's a long, hard ride. It tires your mind.
Okay, Seth, what are you quoting here?
Trying to Love Two Women by the Oak Ridge Boys.
Okay. well, Papa Mau Wow, Elvira, my heart's on fire. Seth, thank you for talking through this book with me. I think this is such a fun first volume. And now I guess I can't really go on to do more podcast until I have read the rest of this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Oh, dude, this was great. We'll come back and do it again. I will be looking forward to hearing about what you think of the other 22 issues of Moonshine, and where the story goes from here. And I know that I'm going to be continuing on reading while I'm trying to also keep up with my regular weekly comics and prepare for the next episode of the show and all that. Man, this has been great.
I've enjoyed it.
Well, I hope that all of you have enjoyed our conversation as well. Write into us by email at graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com, or hit us up on our Instagram page at graphicnovelapostle. And so I will look forward to seeing you all back here. Look forward to getting some of your comments on this book. And until then, keep reading those comics.